Hello, my name is Julie Bonner and I'm presenting the paper Using Personal Data to Support Authentication, User Attitudes and Suitability on behalf of my co-authors Joseph, Florian, Jamie and Mohammed from the University of Glasgow. So the use of personal data for digital authentication does exist. Its use is most apparent in fallback authentication. This is a type of authentication that occurs when the primary authentication fails, normally a user forgetting their password. And it happens through questions like, what's your mother's maiden name or which secondary school did you attend? These questions, though, are often guessable by people close to the user, or their answers may be publicly available on the internet, particularly through social media sites. Use of a more dynamic personal authentication question could mitigate these issues. For example, asking a user, what's the most recent TV show you watched on Netflix, is much more changeable than what's your favorite TV show. To give an example of what an authentication scheme that implements this type of dynamic question and what it could look like, I show here a 3x3 grid of potential TV shows, and the user is asked to select which of these is their most recent TV show or shows. Past research by Das et al. Showed that an authentication system that asks user questions based on their day-to-day experience does have application in high-risk situations, and their simulated system was also shown to have a high user confidence rate. Han et al. Showed that phones data, including apps installations and call logs, were promising data types for authentication due to their high recall accuracy. In another study, they also found that location-based security questions maintain this recall accuracy while also achieving a high level of security against adversaries. Chasen et al. Suggested that future authentication schemes should not rely on a user's ability to memorize random information, as well as Constantinides et al. Indicating authentication becomes stronger when based on past experiences. This work demonstrates that a password scheme using dynamic personal data could have merit. However, before such a scheme is adopted in the real world, we believe it important to first investigate how users perceive this use of their data and what data types are most suitable to ensure that this scheme does work in practice. To understand this, we conducted a survey collecting qualitative and quantitative data on our users' perception of dynamic personal data passwords. We were interested in understanding their perceptions across different data sources, and so we collated a list of 10 different data types to base our questions off of, such as activity on streaming platforms or recent physical locations. Most quantitative questions were asked on a 5-point Likert scale for each type, and most qualitative were asked for non-mandatory free response comment boxes. After initially asking for demographic data of age, gender, country of origin, and frequency of digital login, our survey focuses on 2 key areas: the perceived privacy and the perceived efficacy of personal data passwords. For privacy, we aim to understand their general comfort level towards personal data password, their perceived security, and if and how they would change their behavior in the real world if they understood their data was being used for authentication. For efficacy, we aim to understand the update frequency of the data types, who else in their lives would know their personal data, and their perceived memorability. Our survey closes with 2 open response questions, asking our participants for their previous experience with personal data passwords and for them to give any additional feedback. We recruited 100 participants from 28 different countries, 49% from within the UK. Aged between 17 and 66 with a mean age of 32, 61% identified as female, 36% identified as male. When asked to score their comfort, we found that users were generally uncomfortable with the idea of using their personal data for authentication, though the degree of this discomfort did vary across the data types. We found that photos were significantly more uncomfortable than most other data types, and significant differences were found between the other types. When asked to justify their responses, 19 participants suggested it was due to privacy and security concerns generally. A further 6 participants were more detailed, specifically expressing discomfort due to others potentially being able to see their personal data on the login screen. If you look at the example on the left, a bystander may be able to see their selection. And though this may not give them access to the account, they will have learned information about the user. Participants also mentioned unease based on cross-platform sharing of the data. Participant 93 quoted, "Uber Eats asking me about my past order I'm somewhat comfortable with. But if Instagram asks me where I was at 2 p.m, I'm very uncomfortable." Additionally, concern was raised around this authentication scheme ability to integrate with services that allow multiple users to log in under one account. For every data type, we find that a proportion of our participants did suggest they would change their behavior if they knew that their personal data was being used for authentication. When asked to explain why they would make this change, 12 participants suggested that it was due to bystanders being able to view their authentication screen. Participant 32 stating, "Most of these I'd be worried that it would come into my screen when I was in front of other people." Another 11 participants stated that a feeling of being watched or observed would encourage them to change their behaviour. These participants suggested that even if the data was already being stored, being forced to observe its usage would make them hyper-aware of their digital footprint. Participant 15 stating, "Even though I know this data is already being stored, being even more aware of it and seeing it presented makes me more self-conscious." 8 participants suggested that they would change their behaviour to opt out more sensitive data types. For example, in the case of supermarket orders, bananas and apples may be acceptable, but medication and period products may not be. We found that update frequency varied across different data types, with some data types updating multiple times a day, others only monthly. Only 13% of our participants indicated that they had experienced personal data in authentication before, 8 of these in relation to banking. When asked to give any comments, participants gave feedback consistent with that given in the other 3 comment response boxes. Additionally, 1 participant indicated that chronic illness could make this type of authentication challenging to use. We found that participants' apprehension towards dynamic personal data for authentication was due to a variety of reasons, including bystanders being able to view their screen and gain information about them, companies gaining access to new data they previously would not have had, being reminded of their past actions, as well as an increased hyper-awareness about data collection. Given the variation we found in update frequency, it is important to understand that infrequent data change negates the advantages of dynamic personal data passwords. An update frequency should at least match that of the login frequency in order to maximize the advantages of using dynamic personal data. Consideration must be given to the type of memory required to use these systems. Short-term autobiographical memory could be challenging for some users due to a variety of reasons, including illness. And an authentication scheme like this relies heavily on that type of recall. An authentication scheme that provides usable and memorable authentication for one user may be completely inaccessible for another. Some participants raised a concern of a potential issue when it comes to multiple users having access to the same account. This provides a challenge, as if it wasn't the directly logging in user that created the data required to answer the personal data password, they may struggle to get it correct. This account sharing can happen in multiple ways, one of which being a family plan-like service, where multiple accounts fall under one payment plan, though these can often have separated logins. Some services such as Netflix, however, allow multiple users under one login. In a situation like this, it may be beneficial to allow users to select which sub-account they are before asking them any personal data passwords, though this may not always be possible. Account sharing also occurs even when the services do not expect it to, nor do they have the infrastructure to support the sharing, such as sharing an online banking password. Despite this activity not being recommended, the personal data passwords will have an impact on the usability of the service. Our paper is concluded with 3 lessons learned. 1, that sharing the data across parties causes concern for users. Users who are okay with Spotify accessing their music listening history may not be okay with their bank accessing that same data. 2, that the data subject matters more than the specific data type. Some data is just too sensitive regardless of opinion on the overall data type. 3, that any scheme using personal data should aim to avoid displaying information on the login page. Bystanders should not be able to gather any information about the user based on the login page. In cases where data must be displayed, an effort should be taken to obfuscate the data on the page. More details on perceived security, who else knows the user's personal data, and perceived memorability are included in the paper. Thank you so much for listening.